The battlefield of Varith 7 was silent now, but the scars of war remained. Smoke still curled from the ruins of Zorinthian war machines, and the bodies of fallen soldiers lay scattered under the dim red sky. The once proud army of the Zorinthian Empire had been defeated. Among the captured survivors stood Princess Slilarry, her silver-white skin streaked with dust and blood, but her posture remained straight, her violet eyes calm. She was royalty. She would not break. Across from her stood the human commander, Jason Hale. Unlike the armored soldiers behind him, he wore only a simple combat uniform, but his presence was stronger than any metal plating. His piercing blue eyes studied her, unreadable, as if measuring her worth. "You are the leader of these troops." Jason's voice was steady, not mocking or cruel, just stating a fact. Slilarry lifted her chin. "I am Princess Slilarry of the Zorinthian Empire," she declared. "I demand to speak with your superiors." Jason's expression didn't change. "You don't get to make demands, Princess," he replied. "Your forces are defeated. You are our prisoner now." A ripple of unease passed through the Zorinthian soldiers behind her. To be taken prisoner by humans, it was something they had always considered worse than death. Their empire believed humans were ruthless, unpredictable creatures, uncivilized and barbaric. But as Slilarry stood there, watching this human commander, she found no brutality in his face. "Then what do you plan to do with us?" she asked, keeping her voice strong. Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That depends," he said. "We don't execute prisoners, if that's what you're worried about." Slilarry narrowed her eyes. "You expect me to believe that?" Jason's gaze didn't waver. "Believe what you want, but we don't slaughter those who surrender. That's not our way." Slilarry felt something strange, a flicker of doubt in her beliefs. From childhood, she had been taught that humans were vicious and cruel, that they fought not for honor, but for conquest. Yet this man, this commander, was not gloating over his victory. He was not treating them like trophies or prey. Instead, he turned away, speaking to one of his soldiers. "Get them medical attention. Make sure they have food and water. We'll transport them to the holding camp soon." Slilarry clenched her fists. Why was he showing them mercy? She could feel the confused gazes of her people behind her. They expected her to stand strong, to resist, to never show weakness. But this situation was not what she had prepared for. As the human soldiers led them away, Slilarry kept her head high. No matter what happened next, she would not let this human see her falter. But deep inside, a seed of curiosity had been planted. Who were these humans really? And why did this one make her feel so unsettled? The cold metal walls of the holding chamber surrounded Princess Slilarry, but she refused to let them make her feel trapped. She sat on the simple bench, her hands resting on her lap, her posture as regal as ever. Her people expected strength from her, and she would not disappoint them. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Commander Jason Hale stepped inside. He carried no weapon, wore no armor, and yet there was something about him that made the room feel smaller. His blue eyes studied her, sharp and calculating. "Princess Slilarry," he said, his voice calm. "I assume you've had time to rest." Slilarry lifted her chin. "Do not pretend to care about my well-being, human. If you have questions, ask them." Jason smirked slightly, as if amused by her defiance. He pulled up a chair across from her and sat down, arms resting casually on his knees. "All right, I'll get to the point. Your empire has been attacking human colonies for years. You were leading these forces. Why?" Slilarry met his gaze without flinching. "You think I will betray my people so easily?" Jason leaned back. "I think you're smart enough to know when a war is over. I don't need secrets. I need to understand why your empire started this fight in the first place." Slilarry hesitated. No human had ever asked her this before. They assumed Zorinthians were conquerors, just as her people assumed humans were savages. But was that the full truth? She had spent years believing her empire was fighting a noble war, But looking at Jason now, doubt crawled into her mind. "You wouldn't understand," she finally said. "Try me." Silari took a slow breath. "Your people expand too fast. Your colonies grow like wildfire, taking over planets that were once unclaimed. The Zorinthian Empire has ruled these regions for centuries. Your presence threatens our stability." Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. "We didn't take your planets. We settled on empty ones. If your empire wanted them, why didn't you claim them first?" Silari frowned. "We do not rush to take what we do not need." Jason sighed, shaking his head. "So, because we moved faster, we became your enemy." She didn't answer. The logic felt weak now that he said it aloud. Jason leaned forward. "You were raised to believe humans are the enemy, weren't you?" Silari's fingers twitched slightly, but she kept her expression cold. "And you were raised to believe Zorinthians are bloodthirsty warlords." Jason smiled, just a little. "Fair enough." He stood up. "We're not going to torture you, Princess. That's not how humans work. But we do want this war to end. The question is, do you?" Silari didn't answer, and Jason turned to leave. But before he stepped through the door, she spoke softly. "I do not know anymore." For the first time, Jason paused. He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he left the room. Silari sat there, staring at the door. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she had been fighting for the right side. Princess Silari expected the worst. She had been told stories of human prisons, cold, harsh places where prisoners were treated like animals. But as she was led through the human base, she saw something unexpected. The corridors were clean, the soldiers moved with discipline, and the atmosphere lacked the cruelty she had been warned about. No one mocked her, no one hurt her. The humans treated her as a prisoner, yes, but also with a strange level of respect. A door slid open, revealing her temporary quarters. The room was simple but far better than the dark cell she had imagined. A small bed, a table, even a sink with fresh water. It wasn't a royal chamber, but it was decent. Silari turned to Commander Jason Hale, who had escorted her. "Is this some kind of trick?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Jason folded his arms. "No trick. You're a prisoner, but we're not barbarians." Silari hesitated. "I do not trust human kindness." Jason sighed. "Yeah, I figured." He took a step forward, his blue eyes calm but firm. "Look, Princess, I know you think we're monsters, but we're not here to humiliate you. You have your dignity. We respect that." Silari stared at him, searching for deception. She found none. This was confusing. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. Jason shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do." Silari felt something strange in her chest. Frustration, confusion, or was it something else? She had been trained to resist torture, to endure suffering, to expect hostility. But Jason wasn't using any of those tactics. He was breaking her defenses with patience and reason. Silari clenched her fists. "Do not think this kindness will make me betray my people." Jason smirked slightly. "I never asked you to." He turned and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced back. "Food will be brought soon. You should eat." And with that, he was gone. Silari sat on the bed, staring at the closed door. This was not how it was supposed to be. She had expected interrogation, cruelty, maybe even execution. But instead, the humans were different. Not weak, not foolish, but something else entirely. For the first time, she wondered, was everything she had been taught about them wrong? Princess Silari sat at the small table in her quarters, her mind unsettled. The tray of food before her remained untouched. The scent of the meal was unfamiliar, but it was fresh and well prepared, not the tasteless rations she expected from human captors. She hated this. She hated how these humans were not acting like the monsters she had been taught to fear. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door slid open, and Commander Jason Hale stepped inside. He carried no weapon, no guards, just the same calm expression that irritated her more than she wanted to admit. "You haven't eaten," he observed, glancing at the untouched meal. Larry lifted her chin. "Perhaps I do not trust human food." Jason smirked and pulled up a chair across from her. "It's not poisoned, if that's what you're thinking." He picked up a piece of fruit from her tray, took a bite, and chewed casually. "See, perfectly safe." Larry narrowed her eyes. "You are trying to prove a point." Jason shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just hungry." She studied him. This human was different. He wasn't trying to intimidate her, yet his presence carried authority. He wasn't trying to manipulate her, yet his words always seemed to push her thoughts in directions she didn't like. "Why are you here, Commander?" she asked, crossing her arms. Jason leaned back. "I wanted to talk. Try to understand you, your people." Larry scoffed. "Understanding leads to weakness." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You really believe that?" She hesitated for just a second, too long. Jason caught it. "You're smart, Princess," he continued. "Smart enough to know that the things you've been told about humans aren't adding up. We could have left you to die on that battlefield. We didn't. We could have thrown you into a dark cell. We didn't. We could have forced information out of you, but we didn't." Larry clenched her jaw. Why was he right? Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So tell me, Larry, why are we still fighting this war?" She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Because your kind spreads like a disease. You take what is not yours." Jason sighed, rubbing his chin. "Let me ask you something. Before this war, before humans ever set foot in this part of the galaxy, how many of those claimed planets did your people actually live on?" Larry opened her mouth, then stopped. She didn't know. Jason saw her hesitation. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Anger flared inside her. He was twisting things, making her question herself. "You assume you are right, human," she said coldly, "but I will not be broken by your words." Jason smirked. "I don't need to break you, Princess. I just need you to think." With that, he stood up and walked to the door. "Enjoy your meal." The door closed behind him, leaving Larry alone. She stared at the food, her thoughts a storm inside her mind. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was on the right side of this war. Princess Larry lay on the bed in her quarters, her mind restless. She hated how Commander Jason Hale's words kept circling in her thoughts. He was making her question things she had never doubted before. Why was he so different from the humans she had imagined? Her sharp hearing caught the softest of sounds, a shift in the air, a movement too careful. Larry's instincts screamed at her. Someone was in the room. She moved just as a blade slashed down where she had been lying. Rolling off the bed, she landed lightly on her feet, her violet eyes flashing with anger. A shadowed figure lunged at her, a Zorinthian assassin. Her own people. Larry twisted away just in time, the blade missing her by inches. She recognized the assassin's uniform, the Leap Deathsworn. These were warriors sent to eliminate traitors. But she wasn't a traitor. "You shame the Empire, Princess," the assassin hissed. "You were captured. You will not be allowed to speak." Larry's mind raced. They feared she would betray them. They had sent someone to silence her before she could even consider it. How could they think she would break so easily? The assassin attacked again, too fast for a normal warrior. But Larry had trained all her life. She dodged, grabbed the assassin's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground. Before she could strike back, the door to her quarters burst open. Jason Hale, the human commander, took one look at the scene and reacted instantly. He lunged forward, tackling the assassin before they could retrieve their weapon. The two struggled, but Jason was faster, stronger. With a sharp movement, he slammed the assassin against the wall and pinned them down. "Who sent you?" Jason demanded, his voice like steel. The assassin hissed in defiance, their violet eyes glaring. The Empire does not tolerate weakness. Jason's expression darkened. So they'd rather kill their own than risk them talking. The assassin spat at him. You humans corrupt everything you touch. Jason knocked them unconscious with a precise hit, his face unreadable. The room fell silent, except for Silari's heavy breathing. She looked at Jason. He looked at her. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, but something dangerously close to trust. You saved my life, she said quietly. Jason met her gaze. Yeah, that's what we do. Silari swallowed hard. This was not how it was supposed to be. Her people had abandoned her. This human had not. And now, she no longer knew where she truly belonged. The quiet was deafening. Princess Silari stood across the room from Commander Jason Hale, her heart still racing from the assassination attempt. The still body of the Zorinthian assassin lay unconscious on the floor, a silent reminder of the danger that had just passed. She couldn't stop her hands from shaking, though she didn't want to admit it. Jason stood near the door, watching her with a calm, almost distant expression. His eyes weren't cold like she expected. They were steady, unblinking. He wasn't staring at her like a defeated prisoner. He was watching her, trying to understand her, as though she were something worth paying attention to. Why did you save me? Silari asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jason didn't immediately answer. He moved toward the unconscious assassin, checking to make sure they weren't going to wake up anytime soon. Then, turning back to her, he said, "Because you're not my enemy." Silari's brow furrowed. "I'm a Zorinthian princess. I was leading an army against your people. I'm the enemy. And yet you saved me. Why?" Jason walked closer, his boots making soft thuds on the metal floor. He spoke slowly, carefully. "Because you're not the enemy I was told about. And maybe it's time to stop believing in all the old stories." The words hung in the air, and Silari stared at him, her chest tight with confusion. What did he mean by that? Her mind raced, recalling the years of training, the hatred for humanity that had been drilled into her from an early age. Humans were supposed to be savage, unpredictable, a species that only knew how to conquer and destroy. But Jason was different. He hadn't treated her like a prisoner, nor had he gloated over his victory. He hadn't even judged her, despite her heritage, her title, and her past. "I thought I knew what humans were," Silari murmured. "I thought I knew what we were fighting for. But you," she hesitated, "you're nothing like what I was told." Jason took a deep breath, crossing his arms. "We're not all the same. No one is." Silari's mind was spinning. How could that be true? After all, her people had fought countless wars against humanity, believing it was their duty to stop the human infection. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I was raised to fight, to win. But this," she gestured at the room, at Jason, at the fallen assassin. "This isn't a battle. This is something else." Jason's expression softened. "It's not about winning, princess. It's about understanding each other." The words pierced her thoughts like a beam of light through a fog. Understanding. How could she have spent her entire life believing in one version of the story, only to face the truth now? She was supposed to be Zorinthian, loyal to her people, but the longer she stayed here with the humans, the more she felt like she was living a lie. Was she betraying her own people by even considering this? Jason stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You can make your own choices. What you decide will determine who you really are. Don't let your history define you." Silari swallowed hard, feeling something shift inside her. For the first time in her life, she was no longer sure of everything she had been taught. But for the first time in her life, she was also beginning to question if she could trust herself. The sun had set, and the quiet hum of the human base surrounded Princess Silari. It was late, but sleep eluded her. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her. The assassination attempt, Jason's actions, and the confusing thoughts swirling in her mind had left her unsettled. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The door to her quarters opened with a soft hiss, and Sci-Fi's eyes immediately went to the figure standing in the doorway. Commander Jason Hale. He had been different since the incident. More understanding, yet distant in a way. She knew he was still trying to get through to her, trying to understand her, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to let him in. Jason paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her standing by the window, her posture still as regal as ever. Yet there was something in her eyes. A conflict. "You're not sleeping," Jason said, his voice quiet. Sci-Fi turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "It's hard to sleep when everything I thought I knew is unraveling." Jason nodded, stepping inside the room. He didn't ask for permission. "I understand. You're not the only one who's been forced to rethink things." Sci-Fi's eyes flickered with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jason leaned against the wall. "I've seen the way your people fight, the way they think. For a long time, I believed the stories too. I thought all Zorinthians were just warmongers, people who wanted to control everything. But then I met you." Sci-Fi's heart skipped a beat. Why did that feel different? She had never been called anything but a princess, a weapon of her people. Jason had spoken to her as though she were someone worth more than that. "You don't have to pretend," Jason continued. "You're not a symbol of your empire. You're Sci-Fi. You're more than just the title they gave you." His words stung, but in a way that made her pause. More than just the title. She had spent her entire life holding onto her identity as a princess, the future of her empire. But now, in front of Jason, that identity felt fragile. Was she just a pawn in a game she didn't even fully understand? Sci-Fi shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. "I'm not like you, human. I don't have the luxury of questioning my loyalty." Jason straightened. "Maybe you don't have to choose between loyalty and truth. Maybe you can have both." She looked at him, struggling to understand what he meant. "How?" He stepped closer. "By understanding that loyalty doesn't mean blind obedience. It means fighting for what's right, for your people, for yourself. Not for an empire that's built on fear and lies." Sci-Fi's chest tightened. She had always believed loyalty meant following her people's orders without question. She had never been told that loyalty could mean choosing something different. Jason's gaze softened. "I know it's hard, princess, but maybe this war doesn't have to continue. Maybe we can find another way." Sci-Fi stood still, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The weight of her duty to her people felt heavier than ever. Yet Jason's words tugged at something deep inside her. Could there really be another way? For a moment, there was silence. Sci-Fi felt torn, as if standing between two worlds, the one she had always known, and the possibility of something entirely new. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Jason smiled, but it wasn't one of triumph. It was one of understanding. "That's okay. No one ever knows right away. But you don't have to do it alone." Sci-Fi stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting it alone. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Princess Sci-Fi stood before the large table in the command center, her violet eyes scanning the holographic map of the region. It was a map of the galaxy, but this one was different. It was no longer just about Zorinthian territories. The war was almost over. Sci-Fi's own empire had crumbled in the face of human resistance. Now it was down to one final battle. The fate of the Zorinthian Empire, the lives of its people, and the chance of peace rested on what Sci-Fi decided in this moment. She looked up at Commander Jason Hale, who stood beside her. His presence was comforting in a way she had never expected. The past few days had been a whirlwind, full of confusing emotions and conflicting thoughts. But through it all, Jason had been the one constant. "Are you sure about this?" Jason asked quietly. His voice held a calmness that only someone who had been through many battles could have. "You don't have to go through with it. The humans will hold their ground without you." Sci-Fi met his gaze, her expression hardening. This isn't just about humans or Zorinthians anymore. It's about ending the cycle. I can't stand by and watch my people destroy everything they've worked for. Jason nodded slowly. I know. But you know there will be consequences, right? If you stand against your own empire, they won't let you walk away. They'll come for you. Silari's fists clenched. I have no choice. If I don't do this, the war will never stop. There will always be another battle, another attack, and I'll never know peace. Jason took a step closer, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder in a gesture of support. I'll be by your side. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Silari had never been offered such loyalty before, not like this. Her people had always been about duty, but here was Jason, offering something different, a partnership, a choice. She inhaled deeply, feeling a wave of determination wash over her. She had always been told to do what was best for the Empire, but for the first time, she realized that what was best for her people wasn't always what was best for their power or their dominance. It was about survival. It was about unity. Silari, Jason said softly. I know it's not easy, but you're stronger than you think. I believe in you. Silari swallowed hard, then gave him a small nod. Thank you, Jason, but this is something I have to do. Together, they turned to face the others in the room. Silari was ready to take the final step, to confront her empire and end this war once and for all. It was going to be dangerous, and it was going to be hard, but she wasn't alone. The door opened, and a group of human soldiers filed in, all ready to follow her lead. This wasn't a battle for control anymore. It was a fight for something much more important, the chance for peace. Silari felt a rush of confidence. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know if she could stop her empire from retaliating, or if her decision would truly end the war. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't afraid to try. And with Jason by her side, the battle ahead seemed just a little less impossible. The air was thick with tension as the final battle loomed. Princess Silari stood at the forefront of the makeshift command center, the hum of activity surrounding her as humans and Zorinthians alike prepared for the confrontation. This wasn't just any fight. It was the turning point, the moment that would decide whether peace could be achieved or if the war would spiral into even greater chaos. She glanced at Commander Jason Hale, who was standing beside her, his expression calm, but his eyes revealing a quiet intensity. He had been with her every step of the way. And now, as they faced the approaching forces of the Zorinthian Empire, she felt a strange sense of trust. He wasn't just her ally in this war. He had become something more, someone she could rely on in ways she never expected. You ready? Jason asked, his voice steady despite the weight of what was ahead. Silari took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. She glanced over the map again, trying to steady her nerves. It was now or never. The war had reached its breaking point. Silari knew that once they made their move, there would be no turning back. Her people would either accept peace, or they would see her as a traitor. And if they came for her, if they tried to kill her, she was prepared to face it. Jason studied her for a moment, sensing her unease. You've got this, Silari. You're not alone. We'll face whatever comes together. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly believe his words. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. Maybe this was the start of something new, for both her people and the humans. The door to the command center slid open, and a soldier entered, panting. Commander Hale, Princess Silari, the Zorinthian fleet is approaching. They're preparing for a full-scale assault. Jason nodded, then looked at Silari. This is it. Silari nodded back, her hand resting on the hilt of a small blade she had brought with her. She wasn't sure if she'd ever need it, but it was a reminder of the life she had led until this point, a life she was now ready to leave behind. I will not be remembered as the one who destroyed her people, Silari said quietly, her voice firm. I will be remembered as the one who ended this war. Jason met her gaze. and you will be remembered as the one who gave everyone a chance at peace." The tension in the room grew as the last preparations were made. There was no going back now. Sci-Fi felt a final surge of determination. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through. The last of the fleet had been deployed, and Sci-Fi stepped forward, leading the way out of the command center. She felt the weight of her decision settle over her, but this time it wasn't the crushing weight of duty. It was the weight of a future she was choosing for herself and her people. As they approached the front lines, Sci-Fi looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above them. For the first time, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, something bright. "Let's end this," she said, her voice steady. "For peace." Jason gave her a nod. For peace. Together, they led the charge toward the final confrontation, ready to face whatever came next. This was their last chance, and Sci-Fi would fight, not for victory, but for a future where no more blood had to be spilled. The battlefield was silent. The sounds of fighting had faded, replaced by the heavy stillness that hung in the air like a fog. Princess Sci-Fi stood at the edge of the command post, her eyes scanning the horizon, looking for signs of movement from the Zorinthian forces. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of the decision she had made. She had chosen peace. She had chosen to stop the war. And in doing so, she had defied her own empire. The Zorinthian Empire would never forgive her for this. But it didn't matter now. They had won. The treaty had been signed. The Zorinthians had agreed to cease the fighting, and the humans had agreed to stop their expansion. The war was over. Behind her, Commander Jason Hale stood, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had stayed by her side through it all, supporting her, fighting with her. He had become more than just an ally. He had become a partner. But now, as the dust settled and the reality of the peace settled in, Sci-Fi couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the last time she would see him. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice soft, but firm. Jason didn't immediately answer. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. He knew what was on her mind. This was it. The war had ended, but their paths were about to separate. "Yeah," Jason said, his voice low. "It's over." There was a long silence between them. Sci-Fi could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything had changed, but what came next? She turned to face him fully, her violet eyes searching his face. There was no anger, no bitterness in his expression, only understanding. "You could go back to your people," Jason said, his voice soft but steady. "You could lead them into a new future. You could be their queen." Sci-Fi shook her head slowly. "I don't know if I can go back to that life. I've seen too much. I've learned too much." Jason took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can always come to Earth. You're welcome there, you know." She paused, thinking. Her heart was torn. She had spent her whole life being a princess, being the future of her people. But now she felt like she was standing on the edge of something completely different. Could she leave her past behind? The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Sci-Fi turned, her heart racing. It was one of the human commanders, bringing news. "Princess, Commander Hale," the soldier said, his voice respectful. "The peace talks have been finalized. The war is officially over." Sci-Fi nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The war was over. And with that, everything she had known for so long had changed. Turning back to Jason, she spoke, her voice soft. "Thank you, Jason, for everything." Jason gave her a small, almost sad smile. "You don't need to thank me, Sci-Fi. You made this happen." They stood there for a long moment, neither of them speaking. The silence was heavy, full of unspoken emotions. Sci-Fi wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure if there were words for what they had shared. Finally, she nodded. "Goodbye, Commander." Jason's eyes softened. "Goodbye, Princess." And with that, Sci-Fi turned and walked away, leaving the battlefield behind her. But she knew, as she stepped into an uncertain future, that she had made the right choice. The war was over, and now the real journey could begin.